Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Margaret Mims from the Department of Learning and Interpretation here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Today we continue our lectures in celebration of the extraordinary exhibition that opened just 2 weeks ago, Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art. One renowned expert on the art and life of Van Gogh said that, quote, Van Gogh is an unusual combination of someone whose art has an instant appeal to people and a human interest story that is astonishing. You can see the enormous appetite for Van Gogh growing certainly by the decade and almost by the year, end quote. Proof of Van Gogh's popularity is that our exhibition is one of 3 exhibitions about different aspects of the artist's work that opened just this month alone in 2019. And at least 9 other exhibitions are currently in the planning stages at museums around the world. Most of these exhibitions tend to be thematic, for example, concentrating on Van Gogh's still lifes or his portraits, or they tend to focus on paintings done in a particular period or a particular place. But the exhibition here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, which by the way is the only venue for Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art, the exhibition in our museum is the only exhibition to trace Van Gogh's entire career, which began in 1880 when he seriously decided to become an artist after failing at several other careers, and ended only 10 years later with his death in 1890. But in those intervening 10 years, Van Gogh produced an astounding number of works, approximately 850 paintings, and 1,500 drawings. Somehow during those 10 years, he wrote at least 800 letters, mostly to his brother Theo. Remember, this is before computers, so you had to write by hand, detailing what he was thinking, what he felt, what he was worried about. So we have lots of primary source material for understanding Van Gogh's paintings in relation to what he was thinking, where he was living, and who his companions were at the time. But this afternoon, our focus is a different aspect of Van Gogh's paintings. This afternoon, we go beneath the surface of his paintings to explore what conservation science reveals about Van Gogh's materials and his working techniques. The impetus for our talk this afternoon came last fall when the museum was approached by Dr. Mamie Moy, who is professor of chemistry at the University of Houston, also in her role as counselor or representative of the Greater Houston section of the American Chemical Society to the national organization. She was looking for ways to partner on a lecture that explored the connections between science, art history, and the conservation of cultural heritage. And here we are today, focusing on conservation issues in Van Gogh's paintings. After our talk this afternoon, the Greater Houston section of the American Chemical Society has very graciously organized some refreshments to which all of you were invited. This little reception will take place in the center section of the museum's cafe, which is through the tunnel, and then just on the other side of the tunnel, the glass wall is the cafe if this is your first time at the museum. So please plan to stay if you can, and we'll tell you again about this at the end. But now, just very briefly, to tell us about the range of activities of the Greater Houston section of the American Chemical Society, I'd like to invite Dr. Mamie Moy to say just a few words before I introduce our speaker. So, Mamie?
Thank you, Margaret. It is a thrill to be here this afternoon to partner with the Museum of Fine Arts Houston to bring you this extraordinary talk dealing with chemistry and the fine work of Van Gogh. Just a little bit about the American Chemical Society, if you're not familiar with it. It's a society that was founded in 1876 by the U.S. Congress and is the largest scientific society in the world. Its mission is to advance the broader chemistry enterprise and its practitioners for the benefit of Earth and its people. Our vision is to improve people's lives through the transforming power of chemistry. Now, there are over 200 branches, both U.S. domestic and international. The Greater Houston section is just one of these groups. The goals of the American Chemical Society are to deliver indispensable chemistry-related information solutions to address global changes and other issues facing the world's scientific community, to provide access to opportunities, resources, skills, training, and networks to empower our members and member networks to thrive in the global economy, to foster the development of innovative, relevant, and effective chemistry and chemistry-related education, to communicate to the public and policymakers the vital role of professionals and chemistry in addressing the world's challenges. We know that from a very, very recent episode not too far from here. The Greater Houston section strives to meet these goals by sponsoring professional development workshops, career fairs, technical seminars, scholarships for high school students, and a special program called Project Seed, which is a program to encourage underserved students to pursue careers in chemistry and chemistry-related fields. We reach out to the community to celebrate Earth Day. So it's just not for chemists, it's for everybody. It's the Earth. And National Chemistry Week, where we really, really show the public what chemistry is all about and how it affects their daily lives. As a member of the GHS board, I was asked to provide a program of interest to scientists and non-scientists. Well, I thought of no better way than to organize a science cafe. Now, we're here today at a science cafe lecture, but we will adjourn to the cafe shortly after the talk. Scientific Cafe is an ACS program seeking to bring and relate chemistry to all facets of life. A Science Cafe event is usually an informal discussion or presentation on current topics of interest to scientists and members of the community. We, in the Greater Houston section, have organized Science Cafe events. We've done this with comparing old and new violins. Why do they sound different? We talk about herbs, and we use those all of the time. The compounds, I'll say the molecules that we find in these compounds. Skin care, and best of all, chocolate. Tea, maybe not so much as chocolate, but wine and beer, and of the beneficial compounds that we find in these. So our talk today digresses from the earlier topics. When viewing the works of art, we see the beauty, colors, and images, but not the chemistry. Today our topic, Chemistry and Art, brings together the creative arts and chemistry. What does chemistry have to do with the works of Van Gogh? Oh, was he a chemist? Well, he didn't really have that much time. We will find out and we learn about the intersection of chemistry and art. We will soon learn of the importance of chemistry in the art world by renowned art conservator, but also a chemist. Thank you.
So, who better to take us beneath the surface of Van Gogh's paintings than Dr. David Bomford, Chief of the Department of Conservation here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and also, and the other major hat that he wears, the Audrey Jones Beck Curator of European Art here at the museum, and in that role, the organizing curator of the exhibition, Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art. Dr. Bomford has been a distinguished figure in the field of conservation science for more than 40 years, serving as Senior Restorer at the National Gallery in London and as Secretary General of the International Institute for Conservation. At the National Gallery London, he worked with many of the great masterpieces of Western art, including Van Gogh's Sunflowers, Edouard Manet's The Execution of Emperor Maximilian, Peter Paul Rumen's Samson and Delilah, and many works by Rembrandt. He has served on advisory committees for numerous restoration projects in the Netherlands, including Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. He was a member of the Rembrandt advisory committees at the Louvre and the Statens Museum in Copenhagen. When Dr. Bomford joined the staff of this museum in 2012, one of his major projects was to construct a new state-of-the-art laboratory, or a series of laboratories, for the museum's conservation department, which is charged with the care and upkeep of the thousands of works in the museum's ever-expanding collections of paintings, photographs, sculptures, decorative arts, furniture, and more. Those new labs were completed last fall. But his topic this afternoon, as Dr. Moy said, is Van Gogh's materials and techniques. You're in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Bomford.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to the American Chemical Society, and welcome chemists. I trained as a chemist about half a century ago, and I ventured down the arcane halls of a discipline called organometallic chemistry in my university research, and I published a paper which was called The Raman Spectra of Trifluoromethyl Selenium Compounds, which was universally ignored, and so I then went to the National Gallery to train to be an art historian and a curator. But chemistry is back there somewhere, and it will inform some of the remarks that I make today. What I want to talk about is Van Gogh's processes, how he made his art, the sort of materials he used, and what materials were available to him, and the sort of different criteria which he used to make his art as that decade of his career, that short 10-year career, progressed. I'm going to look at studio art, represented by his studio self-portrait on the left, and I'm going to look at art made out in the open air, represented by the painting on the right, which is tragically not with us anymore. It was destroyed in the Second World War, but it is one of the most famous images that we have of Van Gogh striding out from Arles to Tarascon with his easel and his equipment on his back and in his hand. I'm going to break it up into a series of topics that particularly fascinate me. This is a very self-indulgent lecture, because I'm going to tell you about things that I'm really interested in, and I think which illuminate the art of Vincent van Gogh. So we're going to alight on things that I think will amuse and entertain you and inform you about what the process is of his art. And the first topic I want to look at is Van Gogh as a draftsman, Van Gogh in fact in black and white. And you can see how clever I've been with that slide. Because he started out as a draftsman. When he decided to become an artist in 1880, he decided that to learn how to draw was the most important thing. And so he imitated other artists, and in the exhibition we have the copy after Jean-François Millet's The Diggers, and it's one of the first exhibits in the exhibition. And it introduces you to the rather tentative beginnings of Van Gogh as an artist. He didn't become a painter really for another 2 years, and he was just practicing his draftsmanship at the very beginning. And he was using certain materials and making sketches in sketchbooks. And in the exhibition we have facsimiles of his sketchbooks, which are fascinating. These are the originals, but in the exhibition you'll see very, very close facsimiles of the 4 sketchbooks that we see here from different periods of his career, from Nuenen, Antwerp, and Paris, from Paris, and then from Auvers-sur-Oise when he was approaching the end of his life. And in these sketchbooks he recorded things he saw, he recorded compositions he made, he recorded ideas he had for future paintings and drawings. And in the exhibition also, we have a display of the main drawing materials that he used. And they're extraordinarily various, put together by our curator of drawings, Dina Woodall, and our conservator of works of art on paper, Tina Tan. This is a wonderful selection of black chalks, of pencils, of reed pens, of lithographic crayons, of inks, and so on. The whole range of materials that Van Gogh used to make his art in black and white. Go and have a look at it, and there is the facsimile of the Noonan sketchbook, which is exactly like the, it's an exact facsimile of the sketchbook itself, quite astonishingly accurate. So go and examine the sort of materials he was using. Especially examine the whole idea of reed pens, because he would cut reeds, actually just out in the countryside, and cut them like a quill pen. He'd cut them diagonally and then split the nib, and it would make wonderful marks with black ink. And on the left, you see some of the sort of marks that a reed pen can make. And on the right, the sort of really rough and ready reed pens of the sort that he was using to make his extraordinary drawings. And he became not only one of the great draftsmen of European art, but he specialized in this particular technique, which is so beautiful, so delicate, so fragile, so characteristic. And we have some of the best of his reed pen drawings in the exhibition. Just to go through a couple of stages in his development, when a year after he decided to become an artist in 1881, he was producing works like this in different materials. And the variety of his materials is so striking that he was experimenting all the time with different forms of black mark making, with inks, with chalks, with lithographic crayons, and so on. So here we have a portrait of the gardener of his parents' vicarage in Eton in September 1881. And then he goes out to a place near Eton, a marsh, where he's experimenting already just a year into his self-imposed training with the reed pen. So here are some of his early reed pen experiments. And it's a very, very beautiful drawing, both of these in the exhibition. He becomes, from that tentative beginning, that naive copy of the Millet that we saw at the very beginning, he becomes an extraordinary draftsman amazingly quickly. I mean, my colleagues in Amsterdam are quite happy to say that actually when he began, he was a very poor artist indeed. But within months, within a year or two, he was becoming one of the great draftsmen that European art had ever seen. And this is an example of that amazing development in his art in The Hague in September 1882. Just 2 years after he began to be an artist, he's making these amazingly complicated and elegant drawings with pencil, but he also experimented with lithographic crayons, which are very, very sort of black ways of drawing. And he's experimenting with the human figure. He loves the human figure in motion, women planting plants or scraping bowls, reapers. And you can see how he's correcting here the line of the hat of this particular reaper with a white, like a white out that you used to use in typing. Perhaps you can't remember that, I don't know. And in the exhibition, of course, we have two of the great reed pen drawings that you will ever see anywhere, which we're very lucky to have. And the sort of skill with which he's making these drawings, with this very, very crude nib that he makes from the reed, are quite extraordinary. So here is the Café Terrace on the Place de Forum, and you can see how he's constructing it in all these very, very characteristic marks. And the last drawing he makes in Arles, and I'm not going to go through his biography in detail for you because that is something you can look up for yourselves, but when he leaves Arles, he makes this last drawing before he goes to Saint-Remy, And it is from the Art Institute of Chicago, constructed entirely with the reed pen and a sort of really black ink. You can see that the ink has gone somewhat brown in this drawing over here, but here the ink has stayed black. And the ink will go brown if it's exposed to light. And you'll notice in the exhibition that the whole exhibition is rather low, has rather low light levels, because even the paintings, the pigments are continuing to change, and we have to be very careful of light levels. So look for these two drawings, which are the sort of crowning achievement of his drawing style with the reed pen. When he was in Arles, he went down to the sea and he made this beautiful drawing of fishing boats on the shore. And this is a very interesting point, because what are the functions of his drawings? He's making drawings for their own sake. He's making them as sketches for future paintings, but he's also making them to record paintings he's done before. This is a sketch for a painting he's about to make. And when he makes the drawing, he makes color notes. So here is red, here is blue, and so on. He makes all the color notes of these brightly colored boats on the shore, and he's going to make a painting of this later on, and we'll see that shortly. And then he draws the postman Roulin in Arles, and this again is the recording of a painting he's already made. So here he's describing it to his brother Theo, and he on the bottom of the drawing, he puts what colors are there. It's a black and white drawing, but he's saying, I made his coat blue, and it's got gold detailing, and he writes that here. Then he sends it to Theo, so Theo can imagine what the painting is like that he's made of this subject. He also makes prints, and he makes just 9 prints. 1 of them is an etching, 8 of them are lithographs, and here is the lithograph he made of the famous potato eaters, and it is in reverse to the painting, because if you sketch out the composition on the lithographic stone, and then you take your print, it reverses the composition. And it was of this lithograph that all the criticism descended upon his head for the ugliness and awkwardness and general undesirability of the potato eaters. So people were looking at the lithograph and saying, this is the ugliest picture I've ever seen. And they were actually commenting unfavorably on the rather sort of prissy position of this hand, how this hand on the kettle here is not doing anything. And so when he sent this lithograph to his fellow artists and his brother, it was this lithograph that they criticized. And here we have his only etching, a portrait of Dr. Gachet, which he made at the end of his life in June 1890, of his doctor in the month before he died, on Dr. Gachet's own etching press. The copy we have in the exhibition is a very special one, because unlike this one, which I'm showing on the screen, the copy we have in the exhibition is actually been annotated by Van Gogh himself. It's actually got extra pencil marks and crayon marks on the etching, which he's done personally. When he was drawing, he was very conscious of perspective. And this is my next category of interest. And when he was training to be that young artist, he was fascinated by the whole idea of linear perspective, how everything goes to a vanishing point. This was a Renaissance concept. And a lot of his early drawings, especially ones in The Hague, have this very rigid perspective. And you can see how everything is going to a vanishing point in all of these particular drawings. And this is actually the view from one of his lodgings in The Hague. It's a watercolor. He's done a drawing and then colored it with watercolor. And over here, just in this area here, is a carpenter at work. And it's the same carpenter you see over here. So this is the same building there and there. And that carpenter used to make things called perspective frames for Vincent van Gogh. And it's the use of the perspective frame, which I'll explain in a moment, that is singular in Vincent's exploration of spatial qualities in a painting and the use of perspective. He shows a perspective frame in this letter, which he writes to Theo, and here is a man and a perspective frame, and he's looking at a scene on a seashore. Here's a palette with colours on, which I'll come to a little bit later, but it's this perspective frame that we're most interested in, and here's a close-up of that same drawing in the letter. And so what a perspective frame consists of is a framework, a rectangular framework with stretched strings, horizontal, vertical, and diagonals, and it can be different sizes, it can be different heights, and so on. And here's a modern reconstruction of a perspective frame, which is shown in the Van Gogh Museum these days. And you can see the rectangular framework and the stretched strings. And the principle of a perspective frame is that you divide your canvas into the same areas. You draw the same grid of horizontals, verticals, and diagonals on the canvas, and then you look through the perspective frame and you copy what you see in each sector, in each segment, onto the corresponding part of the framework on your canvas. And so if you look, for example, at a painting which he certainly painted using a perspective frame, which is done in 1882 when he was just beginning to be a painter, 2 years into his career, and it's the beach at Scheveningen, which is near The Hague. There is actually under here the outline of a perspective frame, and this is how this is just a notional reconstruction of how he would have done it. So he lines up the horizontal of the perspective frame with the horizon that he's observing. Here are the verticals, the diagonals, and he literally copies each sector, each segment onto his canvas and then paints it. And so by setting the intersection of all these strings at a certain point on the horizon, he can reproduce, he can make sure that he comes back to the same composition if he does it over more than one day. When he moved to Paris in 1887, he used the perspective frame a lot. So we have, this is the view from Theo's apartment looking right across Paris, beautiful view from the southern slope of Montmartre. That is Notre Dame, the spires of Notre Dame on the horizon there. And a technical photograph of this, an infrared photograph which penetrates just below the visible surface of the painting, shows that framework actually there, sketched out in pencil lines under the paint, which you can't see on the final painting, but you can see if you look at it with technical photography. So here he's centering his grid on the spires of Notre Dame. He's using that as his fixed point, and then he's copying the sectors of his perspective frame onto the canvas. And he does the same thing with the famous Langlois Bridge in Arles. And again, an infrared photograph, this technical photograph penetrating just under the paint, shows this same grid-like structure under the paint there. And again, he's copying the different parts of the composition, and he's centering his frame, his grid, just on this area of the bridge. And so what he would do is he sets up his perspective frame here on the riverbank. He sketches out the lines on his canvas very lightly, and then he copies it sector by sector and makes a drawing on the canvas, which he then paints afterwards. But interestingly, if you go and look at this painting in the exhibition, you can just see the drawing underneath. If you look at this man's horse and cart, there's a man driving a horse and cart. The horse, the pony there, is actually the underdrawing. It's not paint on top. You're actually peering through the paint and seeing the original drawing underneath. Now, Van Gogh and colour. That's my next topic. And he becomes a painter in around 1882 under the instruction of Anton Mauve, his cousin, a very celebrated painter, and he begins to investigate the whole idea of using colour in his art. And of course, being a painter is what he ultimately wants to be. And we saw that palette earlier and sketched out in the letter to Theo. And on the palette, he lists the sort of colours that he's likely to use in his, the sort of pigments he's likely to use in his paintings. So we have silver, white, we have Naples yellow, we have yellow ochre, red ochre, burnt ochre, sienna, burnt sienna, cobalt blue, and ivory black, and vermilion. And quite often, an artist would put the white pigment next to the thumb hole of his palette. This was, if you look at self-portraits by artists, they very often have the pile of white pigment right next to the thumb hole, so they know where it is instinctively. And here is the last self-portrait that Vincent made in Paris, probably in around February 1888. And you can see he is at work on a canvas. And you can see that he's holding his palette apparently in his right hand, but remember that he's looking in a mirror, so it's actually in his left hand. He was a right-handed painter. And this portrait of him by Paul Gauguin, done the following year, shows him as a right-handed painter. But what is very interesting is that here is his palette. He's got two little pots there, one with oil and one with turpentine to thin his paints. He's also got a selection of brushes there. And the sort of brushes that were available to a painter in the 1880s were quite modern. But brush technology had taken off in the 19th century, and it might sound rather a sort of tall claim to make, but the invention of the metal ferrule transformed the way that painters could paint. Because until the 19th century, brushes were made with a wooden handle, and they were made with a section of quill, and then the hairs, the badger hairs, the squirrel hairs, or whatever, were bound and put into the section of quill on the end of the wooden handle. So brushes were always round in section up until the 19th century. In the 19th century, the metal ferrule, that's the part just below the hairs, was invented, and metal ferrules allow a flat brush to be made. So the Impressionists and Vincent van Gogh could not have painted the way they did if it had not been for the invention of the metal ferrule, which allows flat brushes to be constructed. The other thing, of course, is that the Impressionists and Vincent van Gogh would not have been able to paint out of doors if it hadn't been for paint in tubes. So the whole technology of painting in the 19th century enabled these artists to paint effectively out of doors. Van Gogh's colour supplier in Paris was this man, this rather sort of jolly, jaunty fellow called Julien or Père Tanguy, and he was a colour supplier, and Vincent got his materials from him in Paris, and he continued to get his materials from him, sent from his colour shop for the rest of his career. He had two main colour suppliers, and Père Tanguy was one of them. And Père Tanguy was an incredibly delightful man. If an artist was very poor, he didn't press for payment. He would accept a painting in lieu of payment. So obviously to an impoverished artist like Vincent, he was very popular. But Père Tanguy's wife was a different matter. And she was always telling her husband off for being too kind to painters. But you can see that he was a very sort of amiable person. And this is a wonderful and affectionate portrait of him by Vincent van Gogh, painted in 1887, surrounded by Japanese art. Vincent was incredibly keen and obsessively collected Japanese woodblock prints, and you see many of his versions of those prints surrounding Père Tanguy's portrait. And at the top here we have Mount Fuji acting like a sort of little conical hat on the top of Père Tanguy's head. But what about the palette that Vincent is holding in his hand in that particular self-portrait? And our colleagues in the Van Gogh Museum have actually analysed the pigments present on the palette. And of course, this is a sort of the paints on the palette are the paints that he used in painting the painting. So it's a wonderful clue to the pigments he was using. And actually, they've all been identified, and here are some of the identifications. Some old pigments, some new 19th century pigments, and Vincent was using a lot of the 19th century pigments that had been introduced, such as cadmium yellow, such as zinc yellow, cadmium orange, and so on, emerald green. And they're all pigments that industrial processes had produced in the 19th century, and artists took full advantage of them. He's also signed it beautifully here in cadmium orange, Vincent, 1888. And so these pigments, by and large, the ones you see here, the pigments on the palette, the pigments with which he painted the picture, are relatively stable pigments. But we have to bear in mind that a lot of the pigments that he used were definitely unstable. And so we actually see his actual palette here, which is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And we see some of the pigment tubes that he used from his estate. And some of these pigments, and you can see it's rather blurred, but you can say 3 tubes of chrome yellow, that's what he painted the sunflowers in, and 1 tube of geranium lake made by Tassay and Lote. That's his other color supplier. Père Tanguy was one color supplier, Tassay and Lote was the other one. And that little reference to geranium lake is very significant because Vincent loved this color. It was a beautiful red color, and he knew it was going to fade, but he loved it anyway. And it was a very unstable eosin, and the chemists amongst you just think eosin. And that it's a beautiful but unstable red pigment made by allowing a red dye to settle on the surface of a chalk substrate. And so Vincent used it anyway, and he said paintings fade like flowers, and he was quite prepared for it because he just loved the color. But that geranium lake is something we're going to be looking at in just a moment. The other thing is that Vincent was very keen on exploiting complementary contrasts. And when he was training to be a painter, he looked at the color manual of Charles Blanc, which was published in 1867, and he looked at color wheels such as this. And these are quite familiar to many of you, I'm sure, but essentially there are 6 colors around the edge, and primaries and secondaries are paired. So, for example, the primaries are red, blue, and yellow. The secondaries are made by mixtures of those colors. So yellow and blue make green, blue and red make violet, and red and yellow make orange. And so if you go across the color circle, yellow and violet are complementary pairs, red and green are complementary, and orange and blue are complementary. And so artists knew from the writings of people like Charles Blanc that if those pairs, yellow, violet, blue, orange, and green, red, were put together, they reinforced each other, they enhanced each other. And so wherever possible, they would make those colors adjacent to each other in a painting. And Vincent did it all the time. And so if you look at his paintings and just look for complementary pairs, there they are. The Impressionists also did it all the time, and it becomes so commonplace that you almost forget to look for it, but they're almost always there. So, for example, in the painting of the drawing that we saw earlier, the Café de la Place de Forum, we have beautiful juxtapositions of blue and orange here in the background. The lights of the night lights of the buildings behind are orange against the dark blue of the buildings and the blue of the sky. And you get little red-green pairings here as well, rather subtle ones. Here in the night cafe, and Vincent talked about this in a letter. He said, "I'm deliberately pairing green with red. These are the colors of passion, the colors of violence, the colors of extreme emotion." And so here is this amazing symphony in reds and greens. And this wonderful picture of crabs, which is in a private collection but shown in the National Gallery in London. You can see red-orange of the crabs against the blue-green of the background. So complementary pairs are always there, and you should always look for them. And in his estate was found this rather extraordinary box, a red lacquer box. He owned it, and inside, when it was opened up, were knots of wool. And he would weave together in little balls of wool different colors to try out different color effects. And those color effects are reflected in some of his paintings, like the red cabbages and onions that you see here in the Van Gogh Museum. And these are often shown together as an example of his experimentation with complementary colors. But remember, a lot of those colors are not stable, and we just need to look at that now. So, for example, the self-portrait that we have in the exhibition, done in Paris in 1887, looks very different now to when it was first painted. So his head is surrounded, it's the most beautiful self-portrait, but his head is surrounded by these sort of bluey-grey strokes. And we know that this painting looked very different when it was first painted. It had a sort of purplish background. And these strokes here were purple in color, not bluey-grey. And a red pigment has actually faded in all these strokes. And there is actually a red pigment in between them, glazed over the background, which has completely disappeared. So whether this was Geranium Lake or whether this was cochineal, it's a lake that has literally disappeared. And if you look at the irises, one of the great masterpieces in the exhibition, this too has changed. And I'm going to be talking about brushwork in a minute, but I just couldn't resist showing you this stunning close-up of the irises. And the great thing about this exhibition, when you go in there, just as long as you don't offend any of the security guards, just get as close as you can, because the brushwork is absolutely stunning in most of these pictures. And just get up and look at the irises. And what is extraordinary here is the difference in thickness here between thick paint and thin paint and no paint. So there's quite a lot of areas between the blossoms, between the blooms and the green leaves, where there is literally no paint at all. This is just the bare canvas, the bare primed canvas showing through. But this has undergone a significant color change, and it would have been originally a yellow-violet complementary contrast. And these irises would have been violet in color. And he made this wonderful series of flower paintings just before he left Saint-Remy to go to Auvers-sur-Oise. And he did 4 paintings which are absolutely stunning. The irises in our exhibition are vertical irises, horizontal irises that's in the Metropolitan Museum, a horizontal roses, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and a vertical roses, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And they've all changed color. We also know that they're all from the same piece of canvas, that he's actually bought a long piece of canvas and he's cut it up to make these 4 pictures in Saint-Remy. And if you flip the irises on its side and you flip the roses on its side, and you take, you do what's called weave counting, weave analysis. And this is done, by the way, in Rice University by a wonderful professor, colleague there called Professor Don Johnson. So it's a Houston product, this weave analysis. You can see that you don't need to know the details, but you can see they all join up. The irregularities of the weave, which are represented by these different colors, all join up. So this was one long piece of canvas which he's cut up into 4 pieces to make these 4 paintings. So this is a fascinating piece of technical research, which allows us to see how many of his paintings, and indeed how many of the paintings of Paul Gauguin, who worked with him, actually match up to the same bolt of cloth. So here are these 4 paintings, and we know that they've had red pigment on that's faded badly. Sorry about the quality of the slide, but you can see this is a close-up of the Metropolitan Museum roses in 2015. This is a book plate of the same detail in 1933. And you can see how different they are. And you can see, the red details here are still sort of pinkish, but they basically faded away. And making comparisons like this is very telling. Taking minute paint samples, cross-sections, allows us to see, this is a cross-section from the background of the metropolitan irises, and you can see there's pink below the surface, but up here on the surface, there's a sort of colorless layer, which is the faded red pigment, which has gone away. And here is a detail from the vertical roses from the Metropolitan Museum, and again, the surface has become colorless, and the unchanged red pigment is buried down in the pigment where the light has not got at it. So if we look at an X-ray fluorescence mapping technique, you can actually see where the geranium lake, which is now completely faded away, completely invisible, but the X-ray fluorescence shows us where it is, even though it's now colorless. And so you can see all over the Metropolitan Museum irises, there is geranium lake in all of these blooms, which is now no longer red. This is just a scientific technique of imaging it. This isn't a true color, this is just a color indicating where it is. And so if we look at the paintings as they now are, we can reconstruct electronically on a computer how they once appeared. So along the top row are the paintings with the color restored. And so you can see that the Metropolitan irises had a beautiful pink background, and the actual blooms were pinker. The blooms of the irises were pinker, and here again the roses were much more colorful. So we should always be aware when we're looking at Van Gogh paintings that they're probably not the way they originally were. And of course the famous bedroom is the same. This is the Van Gogh Museum bedroom. There are 3 versions of it. Vincent wrote to Theo saying, I've just painted the bedroom that I occupy in the yellow house, and it has violet-colored walls and purple doors. And of course, if you look at the painting, they're not violet-colored at all. They're just blue. And he said, and all the tiles on the floor are red. And so here again, a geranium lake pigment has faded away, and this is the reconstruction of it on a computer by the Van Gogh Museum, restoring its original colors. So this is a very, very dramatic change. And you can see the red tiles on the floor have also been reconstituted. And there's a beautiful painting also in the Van Gogh Museum called Daubigny's Garden from his last phase in Auvers-sur-Oise. Here again, he's actually used a geranium lake pigment. But fascinatingly, when he was in Auvers, he had no canvas to paint on a particular day, and so he stretched a tea towel. And this is the back of this canvas, and you can see the striping here of the tea cloth. And he's just stretched it over a wooden frame, and he's put a pink layer of priming on, and the pink is still there in the bottom of this cross section. This paint sample, which is just like a layer cake of the different layers of the painting, and the pink is all intact at the bottom because the light has not got to it. But when you peer through the paint, where the priming has been exposed, it's just gone grey. And so underneath paint strokes, it's bright pink, but where it's actually been exposed, it's faded away and just gone grey. Now we should just look at his brushwork, because this is incredibly distinctive and fascinating, and one of the real points of seeing an actual painting rather than a reproduction. And so in his early phase of his Noonan period in the mid-1880s, he was using this very dark tonality, very savage brushwork to depict these the inhabitants of Noonan, these rather brutal pictures. And then, of course, his brushwork changes dramatically as his career progresses. When he gets to Paris, there's still the legacy of the sort of slightly dark style that he's been using in the northern Netherlands. Here's a beautiful black chalk drawing of the same scene. But as he's in Paris, he's observing the Impressionists, he's observing the Pointillistes, he's looking at Monet, he's looking at Seurat, and his style changes. He's a sponge. His style becomes whatever painter he saw yesterday. So there's this extraordinary variety of different styles that he uses in Paris. And so already, you see, by the time he gets to 1887, his palette has lightened up, air and light are coming through his paint, and he's using this very, very sort of delicate technique already, quite different to his Dutch period and his early Paris period. And he's beginning to experiment with pointillism, with little tiny paint strokes and very dilute paint. He's not using heavy oil paint at this stage. He's seen Toulouse-Lautrec at work, who dilutes his paint into a sort of watercolor-like wash. He's using oil paint just like watercolor. And this is what Vincent is doing here. And of course, this is the painting we saw earlier on, which has the perspective frame outline underneath it. And he's copying Seurat. He's looking at pointillism, and he's saying, well, I can do that too. And so he goes out to Asnières along the Seine, and he does a woodland scene. He does a garden with courting couples in the Square Saint-Pierre. And he imitates Seurat with dots and dashes and different things. He's just absorbing all these different styles. And when he imitates pointillism, he doesn't understand it. And this is the interesting thing, because he is sort of looking at Seurat thinking, this is really easy, all I have to do is lots of dots of color. But in fact, he's not really juxtaposing the complementary colors that Seurat did, and he's not putting in the sort of areas of different dark and light that Seurat did. Seurat was so subtle and so clever with his pointillism. Vincent is merely imitating the sort of surface of it and not really understanding what it's all about. But then he gets to Arles, he gets to Provence, and he discovers his style. This is the moment he becomes the Van Gogh that we really know and understand. And so if you look in the exhibition at these two paintings, which are two of the paintings he did as decoration for the Yellow House, the use of brushwork, thick and thin paint, is absolutely astonishing. Again, get up close, look at the surface of these things, and they are absolutely amazing. So here are details of the ploughed fields that you saw. Here's the ploughman at work with the two horses. Here's one of the clouds in the sky. And you can see he's taking oil paints that he's bought from Tassé and Lotte or from Père Tanguy, which is really thick and creamy, and he's just building it up into these beautiful, beautiful passages of impasto. And here are some details from the Green Vineyard, which I think is one of his greatest masterpieces. And actually, if I had to single out a single painting in the exhibition that I stand in front of and say, wow, it's this one, the Green Vineyard. Go and look for it. And here he's just making vines with tendrils of oil paint, and he's building it up into these astonishing thicknesses and really sculpting in paint. It's quite an amazing achievement. And then, of course, when he gets to Saint-Remy, and he does paintings like the Starry Night, alas, not in our exhibition, it doesn't travel, but he's using thick and thin paint to get his effects. So here we have some of the swirls in the sky, and you can see really thick paint, and then in some areas no paint at all. This is just the bare priming peering through the paint. I just wanted to do a couple of slight curiosities now, and one is that he, which is not generally known, he reused canvases, especially in his Paris period. When he got to Paris, he didn't actually have enough canvases to paint on, but he'd brought things with him from Nuenen, and he simply reused the canvases. And so here, for example, is one of his 27 self-portraits that he painted in Paris, and he's painted over a portrait of a woman. So here's the X-ray of that self-portrait, and this is quite clearly a portrait of a woman underneath from the Nuenen period. And so here's a very obvious example of the reuse of a canvas. And because he's painting thick paint over thick paint underneath, it all cracks and starts to shrink, and you get rather difficult passages like this, where the paint all shrinks and exposes the underlayers. And then some of his self-portraits he paints on the back of Noonan canvases. And it has to be, you have to remember that of those 27 self-portraits that he painted in Paris, a lot of them are terrible. And there really are very odd pictures indeed. But these are perfectly authentic Van Gogh self-portraits. But these three are painted on the backs of Noonan paintings. So they are double-sided pictures. So this one is painted on a study of the potato eaters. This one is painted on a bird's nest. And this one is painted on a study of bottles and jars. Another curiosity is repetitions. And this I find absolutely fascinating because you think of Van Gogh as being a spontaneous, slightly crazy painter who just dashed off unique compositions all the time. But actually he had this habit of really disciplining himself and making very careful repetitions of some of his compositions over and over again. And this discipline rather flies in the face of the sort of spontaneous, crazy painter that we like to imagine Van Gogh to be. And so, for example, we saw the drawing of Postman Roulin a little bit earlier on. He made 3 drawings of Postman Roulin and 6 paintings of him, and you see them all here. And these 4 over here all superimpose. They are very careful repetitions of the same composition, and people have puzzled really quite a lot about the function of these repetitions. And there's usually a fairly prosaic explanation that he wanted another version to send to Theo, he wanted another version to give to the sitter. In this case, he wanted another version to give to Joseph Roulin's wife. And so he produced several versions of the same composition, but he varied backgrounds and he varied emphases and so on. So this is one example of that. This is very straightforward. He's really just producing repetitions of his own compositions. But there's an even more extraordinary one, which is when he started to paint the famous La Lésienne, the wife of Joseph Michel Ginoux, who was the proprietor of the night cafe that we saw earlier on. He paints her twice. This is done, and we know exactly when it was done from his letters. It was done between November the 2nd and the 5th in 1888, and this is the original version in the Musée d'Orsay. And then somewhat later, either the next month or even the next year, he does a repetition of it, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this is probably as a gift. He did it to give to the Madame Ginoux herself. But it's thought that Gauguin, this is when they were still getting on, was actually sitting beside him when he was making this painting on the left in early November of 1888. And Gauguin produces a drawing from a slightly different angle of the same woman in the same pose. And this is the drawing that Gauguin made on the same date, November 2nd, 1888. And Gauguin turns this into his famous drawing of the night cafe, which features the same woman in the same pose. So it's simultaneously producing the same portrait that Van Gogh is producing at the same moment. But it gets more strange than that, because when Gauguin flees after the ear incident, and Van Gogh then eventually ends up moving out of Arles and going on to Saint-Remy, Van Gogh still owns this drawing by Gauguin. He takes it with him. And then Van Gogh, makes replicas of the Gauguin drawing. And so here is the Gauguin drawing, and these are Van Gogh's copies of the Gauguin drawing. He makes 5 of these. I'm showing you just 2 here, but essentially this is the most extraordinary discipline that he's setting himself in the psychiatric clinic at Saint-Remy. So here is a very strange and wonderful and fascinating aspect of of Van Gogh's art, which is not widely known. Now, finally, I just want to look at Van Gogh painting out of doors. Did he paint in the studio? Did he paint out of doors? Well, he did both. And it's not always consistent. You know, if we look at a painting, we can't always tell whether it was painted in front of the motif out of doors or back in the studio from memory or from a drawing. So here is that lost painting that I showed you at the beginning, the one that was destroyed in the Second World War. And here is a drawing that he made for the painting. And you can see it's the same scene, but without the figure in the middle. And this is a very beautiful drawing in the Guggenheim Museum in New York. It's not known whether he painted under a parasol. And this might sound a very sort of esoteric and slightly weird thing to talk about. But in fact, artists who were painting out of doors, and this is a Winslow Homer, not a Vincent van Gogh, they often painted under parasols because under the very bright light, such as Vincent would have found in Provence, if you paint a painting in direct sunlight, when you take it back indoors, it's so dark that you can't see it because the sun has given you a completely artificial notion of how bright your picture is. And so often painters would paint under parasols to make the painting dark so that when they took it back inside, it was the right tonality. It's possible here that Vincent has a parasol, I don't know. And he was probably too disorganized and spontaneous to actually carry a parasol with him. But it's just worth bearing that in mind, that a lot of the Impressionists painted under parasols. Corot did the same. And here is that drawing I showed you before on the beach at Les Saintes-Maries de la Mer, and with the color notes. So red, white, blue, and so on. And this he took back to the studio, back to his house, and he made a painting of it indoors. And so here is the painting that he made from that drawing with exactly the right colors that he's noted in the drawing. And he's added a few more boats in the background, which he hadn't observed, but he simply adds in there. So this is definitely a painting made inside, not out in the open air. But this one was made out in the open air. It's a beautiful view of the same town where he painted the boats, but from the north side where you're not actually seeing the Mediterranean Sea. And he's set up his easel here on the edge of this a field of purple flowers and looking at the north view of the town. But he also paints another seascape there. He paints three pictures, the one we just saw, this one, and this one. And you can see this is the same period again, June 1888. And on this one, there are grains of sand in the surface of the paint. And so we know that this one was actually painted on the beach, so that the wind has blown the sand onto the surface of the picture. And there's another little curiosity here about his painting practice, because he signs it rather boldly. If we go back to the painting itself, the bottom left corner is in red, the signature, and so here is his bold signature in red paint. And a thing to look out for with Vincent and with the Impressionists is when they sign in a completely alien color, completely different color, they've got their brush with red paint on, they sign away, and then they've still got a bit of red paint left on their brush, and they can't think what to do with it. And so they go back into the picture and add it in somewhere, just for a few extra touches. And so here is an example of that. When he gets to Auvers-sur-Oise, we begin to find unfinished paintings that were left abandoned. This is the last 2 months of his life. Here's a very beautiful example of an unfinished Vincent van Gogh, which is now in the Athenaeum in Helsinki. And you can see he's just started to sketch in the sky. And this is a wonderful example of how he actually sets about laying down areas of color. And it's Vincent who says, there is nothing so terrifying to an artist as the paralyzing stare of the blank canvas. What do you do with it? And so here we have the blank sky, and this is how he's started to lay in his colors here. And he, when he's in Auvers-sur-Oise. He even at this late stage in his career, he doesn't know it's late, of course, he starts to adopt a completely new format of the double square, these long horizontal canvases or even a long vertical canvas, which are double square in shape. And these ones, by that weave analysis that I showed you earlier, have all been shown to be from these relative positions on the same bolt of cloth. So this is an extraordinary piece of research, and all the weaves line up in these directions. And so I mean, you can see there, and here are two of the last paintings he did, the double square size, this experimentation right up until the day he died. And it's often thought that this, the wheat field with crows in the Van Gogh Museum, was his last painting. That was the legend, the myth, the story, because it ought to have been his last painting. Because here is the road into the wheat field going nowhere. Here are the threatening crows and the tumultuous sky. And it just seems to imply that this is the end of everything. In fact, his actual last painting was the one on the right, the tree roots, which is actually unfinished. And we know from Theo that he painted this painting on the day before he died. And he died on July the 29th, 1890. And that is a little summary of some of the points that fascinate me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bomford, for that excellent talk. I'm Crystal Young. I'm the chair-elect of the American Chemical Society Greater Houston section. And on behalf of the American Chemical Society, we would like to thank you for your extraordinary service with a token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
And in honor of the International Year of the Periodic Table, we wanted to recognize that Mr. Van Gogh was using chemicals in his art, and to commemorate that, we'd like to give you a periodic table art of chrome yellow. And we understand that you're going on a long journey, and we don't want to fill up your luggage anymore, so we made a donation in your honor to the Department of Conservancy.
Thank you very much. Chrome yellow, the colour of the sunflowers. I shall take it back to London with me. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you again, Dr. Bomford. And before we adjourn to the cafe, I have a special thanks for members of the museum staff. I would like to thank Dr. Margaret Mims for the wonderful work that she did for me. And in fact, I did nothing. She did it all. So a small token of our appreciation, Margaret. Another special thanks goes to Dr. Helga Ulrich. Without her help, this would have never happened. So my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Helga. It's very small, so you don't have lots of dust. Let's go party. Yes, like she said, let's go party.